This is going to be video number 92 on your firearms defense channel. This is going to be a continuation of video number 91, where I talk about the cause of the racial problems and the conflict we have in America today and how it actually dates back to the Civil War. Now, I'm doing a report on a book called Everything You Were Taught About the Civil War is Wrong. Ask a Southerner by this author, Locker and Seabrook, and he gets into this issue pretty deeply in the book. You know, it looks like after you read the book, you realize that what we had was just an orderly process in the Civil War era. You know, we had an orderly society in the South. Everything was kind of in its place. Everything was going along pretty smoothly. And the North just declared war on the South for what looks like no good reason at all after you read the book. And they completely upset the natural balance of things and destroyed the order that would have eventually come out of the society. And as I read through the book, I had the impression that if we would have never had the Civil War, and if things would have proceeded in an orderly, fashionable manner, eventually the black citizens of that time would have been freed and would have been integrated into our society without all the conflict and turmoil that we have in this day and age. So I think in many ways, I think the conflict and turmoil that we're experiencing now is a result of what happened during the Civil War, and I think, you know, we've never recovered from that. Now, as I want to read this one section here, you know, there's a lot of myths associated with the Civil War. Now, in fairness to our society, I don't actually remember ever being taught much about the Civil War. I might have just heard a few things about it, but we were never actually taught a lot about it in school that I recall whatsoever. So I'm just going to read a couple of this one thing here, and this will take me through this video. Okay, what you were taught: the South is still fighting the Civil War. Why can't Southerners accept that they lost and moved on? The South is indeed still fighting, but it is not the Civil War. She is fighting for the ideas that her ancestors died for in that conflict to begin with, namely strict constitutionality, states' rights, a small limited central government, conservative Jeffersonian political ideals, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and traditional family and religious values. All of these are being slowly eroded and replaced by the liberal, nationalistic, industry-based Hamilton, big government-loving Federalist North, a process left over from Lincoln's campaign to destroy the old South and modernize her by remaking her in the image of the northeastern states. The last thing any red-blooded Southerner would ever want. Thus the South fights on, not the war itself, but for the ideals over which her ancestors fought and perished. In point of fact, it would be more accurate to say that it is the North who is still fighting the war. Each year, hundreds of books are published on Lincoln's war, nearly all of them slanted towards the Northern perspective. Nearly every one overflows with Yankee mythology, lies, slander, misinformation, and disinformation. Nearly every one is penned by politically correct non-Southerners and traitorous New South Southerners, both who are ignorant of our true history and who thus misunderstand and revile Dixie. Yet when a Southerner attempts to defend his homeland and heritage against this avalanche of ludicrous and often purposely hurtful fiction, he or she is reprimanded for still fighting the Civil War. An apt analogy would be for a person to provoke a rattlesnake into attacking by repeatedly stepping on it, then shooting it for trying to protect itself. A rattler only wants to be left alone to live in peace. So with the average Southerner. But interfere with his or her way of life, and you will have a fight on your hands, even though the defense will usually be made with pen and paper from behind a pulpit or a computer keyboard. The South at heart, still very much a leisurely, peace-loving, agrarian society, is not still fighting the war. It did not want to begin with, and certainly has no desire to continue what the North illegally began so many years ago. However, it is true that the South is still sensitive about the late unpleasantness, and with good reason. Lincoln's war took place on Dixie's soil, in her front and backyards, in her gardens, on her farmland, on her roads and bridges, in her cemeteries, in her shops, and in her houses, farm buildings, and churches. These are considered sacred places in the South, yet all still bear the scars of Lincoln's illicit invasion after nearly a century and a half. During this violent and irrational intrusion, most of Dixie's people were displaced, turning millions of once placid, innocent farming families into terrified, wandering, homeless refugees. Along with this, her infrastructure was destroyed, her telegraph lines cut, railroads torn up, granaries leveled, houses robbed, farms demolished, factories razed, churches torn down, businesses of every kind wrecked, and her females beaten and often raped in their own plundered homes. Even Dixie's schools, universities, libraries, and hospitals were not spared the Yankee torch. Normally, civilized nations at war do not destroy such structures, for it is both immoral and unnecessary to do so. Why then did Lincoln, even as the first of the Geneva Conventions was adopted in 1863, midway through his war? That is not all. Between 1861 and 1865, across the South, pets were sadistically and needlessly killed, and farm animals were stolen by Yanks and used in the fight against their own owners. Animals that could not be impressed and taken away were shot down on the spot before the eyes of anguished families, many in poverty with only a single skeletal mule or horse to their name. Likewise, food and provisions were brazenly pilfered, even from Southern households already starving after months under the brutal Yankee naval blockade, also illegal. That which could not be carried off was summarily burned, as fathers, mothers, children, and grandparents begged for mercy from a merciless invader. Many Southern homes were commandeered for use by Yankee forces. This is not unusual in wartime. What is unusual is that under the Yankee policy of coercion, Southern families were often forced from their homes at bayonet point, even in the dead of winter, with nowhere to go, no place to take shelter. Newborn infants were treated with the same callousness as adults, women the same as men, seniors the same as children. The family's house would then be searched from top to bottom for valuables. In the process, cruel and unthinking Yanks tore beds and linens apart, overturned cabinets, chairs, and tables, broke mirrors, shattered windows, sliced beautiful framed paintings to tatters with bowie knives, smashed family heirlooms to pieces, threw dishes, plates, and cups against walls, stripped watches from men, and tore rings from the hands of frightened girls, angry women, and trembling grandmothers. Neither were black servants exempt from the inexplicable wrath of the federal militia. Strangely, though, after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, the North was alleged to be the friend of the Negro, sent south to free them from the inhuman bondage under cracker rule. Blacks were among the primary targets of white Northern soldiers. Incidents of harassment, beating, torture, rape, and even the murder of Southern blacks by Yankees were all duly recorded in the diaries, letters, and journals of both black and white Southerners. After using a Confederate family's house for their purposes, usually to rest, eat, and plan their next move, Union forces sometimes allowed families to remove cherished objects that had managed to survive the initial Yankee savagery and set them out on the front row. The house was then burned to the ground, often to the heartless laughter of Lincoln's soldiers. Entire communities were treated in this fashion, with some cities utterly disappearing before the onslaught of Yankee boots. Lincoln footwear was often steel-toed in order to expedite mayhem and destruction. Northern war hero General William T. Sherman liked to brag that Southern maps would have to be redrawn after he and his troops passed by. He literally wiped towns like Meriden, Mississippi off the face of the earth. So wonderfully and completely did Lincoln's minions make the South howl that the region has not fully recovered yet, even after nearly 150 years. Indeed, as of 2010, Dixie is only starting to catch up, and in some areas surpass the North. Hundreds of Civil War cemeteries dot the landscape, and homes and buildings whose walls are filled with bullet holes remain, mute but overt testimony of the blizzard of remorseless violence and carnage that was spread across the South by the North during those terrible years. Illinoisan and Lincoln apologist Carl Sandburg, certainly no friend of the South, correctly called the war's effect on Dixie a human slaughterhouse. Southern diarist Mary Chestnut put it this way: "Our world, the only world we cared for, was literally kicked to pieces." In contrast, few Northerners had their world kicked to pieces. Very few northern cities were touched by the war, and in fact most northern states were completely spared and would not have had any reason to think that a major military conflict was raging across North America, except for newspaper reports. Okay, that's going to conclude video number 92 here, and I'm going to continue this analysis on video number 93.